level 5. Future of AI will arise. Level 5 for the road. Steep and out trim gets higher. Level 5.
Hi, welcome to the Level 5 podcast. I'm Steve Outram, and I'm very honoured to be joined by a distinguished guest today, Dr. David Teece. David is the number one rated professor in the world in two fields of academia that you probably have heard of. Both fields are kind of significant: business and economics. That's right. So we're here today to talk about artificial intelligence and, in particular, the dynamic capabilities of humanity. Dynamic capabilities is something that David's come up with, a framework that's been enormously influential over the years. David is the chairman emeritus of the Berkeley Research Group. He's also the distinguished professor at the Haas School of Business at University of California, Berkeley. And these days you're in Florida, David. Welcome to Florida.
Thank you, Steve. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. So you're also associated with a university in Florida?
Yeah, the University of South Florida. That's correct.
Excellent. And how do you find academia in the East Coast over here compared to California?
Well, anytime people are curious and interested in inquiry, it's fun for me. And there's actually some folks here that I've got to know that are very up to speed on the frontiers of knowledge and strategic management, which is my primary focus right now.
Fantastic. And you're a fellow New Zealander relocated to the US?
That's correct. Yeah, I came to the U.S. to get my graduate education, and I haven't left yet.
So what year was that you came to the United States?
1971. It was right at the time that the U.S. was going off the gold standard, so I suffered depreciation on the currency that I was carrying in my pocket as I left for New Zealand for the United States. So it was an interesting times economically.
So as soon as you left the New Zealand shores and arrived on the American shores, the value of your dollar dropped.
Yeah, that's correct.
And what do you think in that time since you've seen a lot of change in both countries? Do you think America has changed more, or do you think New Zealand has changed more?
Probably neither have changed enough to keep up with the technology that is being generated. A lot of it here, of course, originating in the U.S. So, look, the U.S. has changed a lot. It's a very vibrant society. It's a very creative society. It's lost a lot of its manufacturing base, and as a consequence of that, there's been social dislocation. But at the same time, our creative skills and entrepreneurial skills have deepened, and the Silicon Valley mentality has spread beyond Silicon Valley to the rest of America, and in some ways to the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, entrepreneurship is something that I'm very passionate about myself, and when it comes to this world of artificial intelligence, I think one of the really big questions on many people's minds is, what are humans going to do when AI takes all the jobs? And to me, it seems like entrepreneurship is a natural answer to that. That, well, if the jobs are gone, you just have to go out and create your own jobs. But I'm interested, do you have any thoughts on what can humans do if AI takes all the jobs?
Well, I don't think it's going to take all the jobs right away. It's going to certainly take many of the menial jobs and the ones, whether in banking and other areas in accounting, where it's very logical steps. That's going to happen right away. But at the same time, AI is going to be a great assist. I mean, it's a great assist to me right now when I do my research. It's in terms of just staying on the frontier and realizing what other people have done and read and written. It's a help, and it's not yet a deep challenge. But I'm impressed with what it can do. But it will become a deep challenge, and I think it's probably good when the AI is right on the frontier and can challenge me and the things that I do. It's getting there very fast.
Yes, well, one of the things that we like to say in the AI world is this is the worst it'll ever be. And every week it's getting so dramatically better. But this sort of relates to your dynamic capabilities framework, which is the idea of being able to sense what's going on in the environment around you that could affect you personally or your business, to seize the opportunities that you find, but also to transform yourself or your organization to be able to take advantage of new things that came from your learnings from both the sensing and the seizing process. And I wonder how countries themselves can look at dynamic capabilities, their own dynamic capabilities, when it comes to these breakthrough technologies like AI or like the internet was 30 years ago, where those of us who are using it every day see, well, the whole world is going to change because of this quite clearly. And those of us who don't use it every day or maybe haven't even used it at all, like, look, that's not really a thing for me. It's just another new technology. I'll leave it aside. And, I personally have a bit of a concern that New Zealand will take more of that head in the sand approach. And America obviously is leading the world in AI. And do you think in the last 50 years, the two countries, perhaps there's been some similarity in their performance, but over the next 50 years, if one country is the world leader in artificial intelligence and one country says, that's not really for us, we're agriculture and tourism-based economy, how radically different could the paths be?
Well, that was at least 6 questions in one, Steve, but that's okay. Let me sort of go back to the starting point, which is, dynamic capabilities. People have to go through a mind shift. We've all been focused on efficiency, making things more efficient, squeezing more out of what we got. And really, the focus has to change to innovation. And the question with innovation is not just about creating new things, it's about creating new things that actually meet a need. And being very entrepreneurial in fast-changing environments, you really have to have a different mindset. And look, the environment was changing fast even before AI shows up. It's changing faster because of AI. And so we need frameworks for at least for organizations to act, and one might argue for individuals to act too. And that's why this framework I created called Dynamic Capabilities has actually it's become way more popular than I thought that it ever would. But I think I sort of underestimated how unentrepreneurial most of the world was. So it's a framework that helps you bring together entrepreneurship, innovation, change, adaptability, and so forth all in one. And yes, so these 3 big steps: sensing, figuring out what's changing, and sensing and sense making, and then acting or seizing, as I call it, which often involves some kind of CapEx if you're talking about a business, and then transforming. Even if you get it right, it's not going to stay right for very long. You have to be willing to face the fact that the world is constantly changing. You're going to have to change what you do all the time too. And, that's unsettling to a lot of people. And coming back to your themes that, well, okay, what about a little country like New Zealand and a big country like the U.S.? Well, I think the U.S. does have a leadership in AI, but it's really by a thin margin. I mean, China is there breathing up the tailpipe and being very, very, very much devoted to winning. I mean, their commitment to getting ahead, I think, is way greater than most people realize. It's a national priority. We're doing it because that's kind of what we like to do, what people individually decide they want to do. But it's not a national priority, even though the White House now has a paper out there saying it is a national priority. There's no mobilization of resources at the national level yet to make sure that we win in AI. I think it's coming. It has to come, because the only way you can maintain security is to be on the leading edge of AI. And so I think it's going to become more of a priority. And little country like New Zealand, I think that they have to wake up and realize that this is revolutionary. It's revolutionary in a positive way in terms of what it can help you do, but there's also some negatives. There's cyber threats. There's the ability to use AI for negative as well as positive things, which of course has always been true for technology, but is perhaps even more true because it's more amplified. So there's a lot to figure out, and I think it's going to require international cooperation to make sure that we get the positive benefits of AI and can shield ourselves against the negative.
I'm going to come back to this point in a second and pick up on this, discussing specifically for New Zealand. But something came to me as you were talking. That's a perspective that I think I haven't really heard in the AI arms race. We hear a lot in the United States about energy, that we're spending 300 billion or 500 billion or however many trillion it is building all these data centers, and we're going to need to double the entire electricity supply of the United States just for the data centers, just for the AI. But in the meantime, China is massively outstripping our energy build, and they can build much bigger data centers. But the point you've raised is different, which is just that because of that national focus and also their sheer numbers, that they have an advantage in population, they have so many more humans going to the universities, learning about AI, using AI. The view of the AI world is that the AI will do more and more research, the humans will do less and less and less, so the humans won't be so relevant, and whoever gets to get the AIs doing the most research first wins. But potentially there's another approach, that whoever has the most humans doing the AI research actually ends up being in a much stronger position as a nation in the terms of like international competition.
Yes, if you believe, as I do, that at least for the next several decades, humans and AI are going to be, if you will, joined together, and that this is a complementary activity, then China is training up more engineers than we are by a long shot. And many of the engineers we train up don't stay in the U.S. They go back to their country of origin. So there's a level of commitment in China that is scary for us, and we have to recognize that. We cannot remain asleep at the switch. And, leaders are telling us this, but in terms of national action, we're not quite there yet.
Well, I think also culturally, and this is maybe relates to entrepreneurial culture, that the American dream used to be that, you'd get a big house and a white picket fence, and you get your wife and kids and a great big pickup truck, and everything's fantastic, right? And everybody can be a millionaire as long as you want to try. I think for the younger generation, a lot of them growing up, they're being driven into entrepreneurship, not so much to make money and acquire assets for themselves, but either to help the world through social impact or just for lifestyle reasons. That there's an entrepreneurial lifestyle that has been sold to young people, that it's exciting and fun to work in a startup, which those aspects of it can be true, but it can also be incredibly stressful and risky. But there's another aspect of this lifestyle that AI is enabling, which is this digital nomad lifestyle, that you can now travel the world and you can work on your startup from Costa Rica or from Bali, from Mexico, and a different one every month. And you can have your remote working team that you only get together sometimes for these offsite retreats. And I've met, particularly in San Francisco, quite a few young people who they're just driven by that lifestyle. And I think on the Chinese side, culturally, I'm not sure that digital nomad is so much of a driver. I think more that mercantilism is the cultural driver there.
Yeah, and in China, you have what's called young people laying down, which is sort of not enthusiastic about this national goal that Xi Jinping has put out there, and jobs are much harder for them to find. And you're right. What we have in the West, what we have going for us, is this enormous mobility, the ability to work remotely, but to travel between countries, and to essentially form enterprises with people anywhere. That's nowhere near as well developed in China. That said, we don't shortchange China. China is a very capable place, and their commitment, their commitment to winning here is palpable. Let's hope that we can stay ahead and at least not be left behind.
Well, it's interesting. I look at what's happening in the world of AI, and the Chinese models are really very impressive, and they haven't just taken what the West has done and copied it. They've actually had to route around the sanctions and things that we've imposed to make life more difficult and slow their development, has actually accelerated their development, because it's forced them to think about these problems in different ways and build some really quite remarkable innovation. So I think there's, hats off to the Chinese AI industry for their innovation. It's impressive, but at the same time, from a geopolitical point of view, this is being weaponized. They're taking America's like leading light new industry that's creating trillions of dollars of value, leading the NASDAQ and the market forward, and that whatever our private companies come up with, they're able to just basically take that, turn it into the open source world and give it away for free, thus undercutting this industry. And you know, they're in a economic position to kind of underwrite this activity. And I think one consequence of them being able to do that is what it means for open source as a movement. So Meta, formerly known as Facebook, their approach to AI has been, we're going to open source this. This has to be open for humanity. Google's approach to AI, I think, has been it's a valuable technology to us, but the rest of our business is, you know, such a strong cash flow producing moat that we don't, you know, we can underwrite AI, so we'll probably be able to underprice the competition. And then China's approach is, well, open source, but let's not focus so much on the collaborative side of it. It's more, here's a way to take this stuff and make it free. And so this you know, complex playing field where you have nation level actors and incredibly large corporations who in many cases are more wealthy than nations, all kind of competing with a view of the long-term future. And then you have this underpinning idea that whoever gets there first is going to win and take over the world, which I have my own thoughts about that maybe we get into it a little. But this, you have a concept in addition to dynamic capabilities, David, dynamic competition. Is this an example of where dynamic competition comes into play?
Yes and no. So on the one hand, of course, China is going for open source because they want to undermine the West, and it's all geopolitically driven. It's not just that they're nice guys and think that, oh, we want to provide technology and be part of technology that's available to everybody. Because open source sounds great at one level, but when you realize it's being manipulated for geopolitical reasons, then you think about it differently. So you know, I would just make that point.
Right, and what about these corporations that are becoming so large that they're, you know, they're competing with countries on some level?
Yeah, but you know, we've always had large countries, large companies. I mean, I remember in the '60s, the Europeans were worried about General Motors. And Jean-Jacques Savin-Scriver has this book, Le Défi Américain, which is, oh, the big bad Americans are arriving with big conglomerates and corporates that are going to swamp poor little Europe. Well, look, you only stay big so long as you're good. And if there's a misstep, you know, and you know, you look at Apple right now, and Apple's behind in AI, and if they miss out on the AI revolution, you know, they've still got, you know, lots of relevant capabilities, but it's going to compromise them for the long term. None of the big companies, in my view, have, you know, a guaranteed seat at the table. They maybe for one round of innovation, but if they miss, they don't get a second chance. So they're a lot more fragile than people believe. I'm not saying they're delicate. They're not, because once you get a leadership position in AI and digital platforms, and you assemble large amounts of data, you can assemble more data. So there's an increasing returns story behind it all. But at the same time, you know, the nature of competition has changed, and this is partly the story of dynamic competition. You know, it used to be that people would compete in an industry, but now it's across industries. I mean, there's no limit to things digital. You know, broadcasting, advertising, everything is thrown in one big pot, and that means that you've got a lot more competitors to worry about. You don't know where the next competitor is coming from. So I like to say that sometimes the most significant competitors are the unseen competitors. You know, in the past, you'd know who your competitors were, but potential competition now can crop up from anywhere. So I think the world's actually a lot more competitive, despite the fact that, you know, people that crunch concentration ratios will say, oh, look, concentration ratios are going up, it's less competitive. I think we're more competitive. Simply because of this lateral competition and the number of startups. I mean, venture capital over the last 30 years has grown significantly, and you never know where capital is being deployed. And if you're a big company, let's take Amazon. I think it's not by accident that Bezos says we focus on customers, not competitors. Why? Because if you focus on competitors, you're going to focus on the ones you see. You're not going to focus on the ones you can't see. So how can you protect yourself against the ones you can't see? By delivering the best customer service possible. And if you stay ahead in that way, you stay customer focused, that's the best defense. All the textbooks in economics, everybody is a competitor and looking over their shoulder at who's next to them and so forth. This is not the way big companies operate. And you listen to what CEOs say, and it's very clear to me that what they fear the most is the unknown. I mean, Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, had a book titled "Only the Paranoid Survive."
Great book.
Yeah, and it's because you don't know where competition's coming from. And so this really screws up the basic paradigm that we use in competition economics. And I've recently written a paper saying that potential competition is probably way more important than actual competition. That's one way to frame this. And that requires that you assess competitive environments in very different ways.
It sounds to me that this is actually one problem that AI could be quite good at helping entrepreneurs to solve, to find who am I competing with that I haven't thought of and don't know about yet. Who isn't on my radar but I should be watching.
Yeah, well, certainly it can help scanning the environment. If anything is in the public domain, it can help. But if it's not in the public domain, actually the government, because the government has the power of subpoena. I mean, the government can go poking in corners, and the government can learn things that private individuals can't because it's got the power of the court to go in and figure out, okay, is this company a potential competitor or not? So, antitrust enforcement is on the one hand more difficult when you can't see who the competitors are, but to some extent the government's also in a better place because they can get information through subpoena that private parties cannot get typically. So, it just requires looking at everything through a new lens. So dynamic competition is about taking a new lens and tossing away what I call static competition, which was formulated in the industrial period when it was all about atoms, not electrons. If we're in the world of digital, it's all about electrons and you need a different framework. That's why I've had to formulate dynamic competition. Now, I started on that 30 years ago when there weren't too many digital things around, but it was on the horizon even back then. I remember, one of the Japanese companies talking about NEC, CNC, computers and communications. That was going to be the future, and that was really all about this coming together of industries and competition changing in nature, and now it's deeply manifest.
Now, you wrote about Apple, I think it was 2013, and you said don't write them off yet because of their dynamic capabilities. You recall that article?
Yes. Yeah, what I said back then, this was a time that Steve Jobs was passing away, and people would say, oh, does this mean the end of Apple? And my answer was, no, because a lot of the kind of rules of engagement, if you will, that Steve Jobs had developed were deeply embedded in the organization. And indeed, and my prediction was right. I mean, it's done well. It's done well for another 15 years. Just by continuing along the path that Steve, had developed. And, it's not just a hardware company today, it's a services company too. So people always think, oh, it's just about the iPhone. But if you look, I think services are like 30% of their revenues. But at the same time, and Cook has been great in terms of developing and expanding the pathway that he inherited. But he's, I think, a little bit flat-footed around AI, and I'm curious actually as to what your point of view might be on that. But I think that there needs to be a sea change, and Apple has to more aggressively do something maybe it never done before, which is go out and acquire something One of the things that Steve Jobs left was a heritage of be wary of acquisitions. And by the way, I always think you should be wary of acquisitions. If you're a buyer, it's almost always the case that the seller gets more out of it than the buyer does. But I think, given Apple's balance sheet and the predicament they're in, I don't know who it is they might buy, but they got to do something to dramatically accelerate their commitment and capabilities in the area of AI.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great illustration of the dynamic capabilities framework in action and the value that it can provide. That a share of Apple stock back then was about $13, and if you'd bought that today, that single share with all the splits and adjustments they had would be worth about $6,000. So close to a 500x return on a company that was already a public company and already one of the strongest, most iconic brands in the world. The idea that it could get a 500x return is almost inconceivable. But did you think back then, even 10 years ago, that we would be in an era of multiple $1 trillion plus corporations?
I didn't think all that hard about it, but I did see, that there was definitely a growth and development path ahead. I think the real question is, if I was thinking about it back then, is it possible to manage such a large organization? And actually, I think this is where AI and algorithms and so forth have helped. I mean, Amazon, I think, is built a highly, highly automated system and has been using, I guess you would call it lower level AI for a decade or so to run their business. And so,
with some of the best human minds in the world as well.
So there's been a big AI assist that's quietly been going on that's enabled these companies to scale beyond what may have been otherwise possible. So I think that's probably, yes, I think I probably am. I wouldn't be surprised, I think, if I really thought hard about it, that companies have grown as big as they have, but not given the tools that are available.
Right. Well, to your point about Tim Cook, I think it's interesting to look at him, Satya Nadella at Microsoft, Sundar Pichai at Google. Those three have come in, and I wouldn't really describe them as innovators. I think they're executors. They've come into something that was founded on an enormous amount of creativity and innovation, and they've just basically come in, taken the systems and optimized them. But the result of that has been growing these companies from 200 billion to 2 trillion plus. And you could say kind of the same Sheryl Sandberg's era at Facebook, Meta as well, that, the innovation was a lot before she came in, and since then, the innovation hasn't really been a massive driver of growth compared to acquisitions and executions.
Although you have to say with Nadella, he's really doubled and tripled down on cloud computing, and likewise, I mean, Amazon created cloud computing too, and
strategic innovation. I would describe that.
Yeah, that's true. They didn't come out of their own R&D labs, is what the point you're making. And that is a concern. I mean, if you look at the big digital platforms, they are spending enormous amounts on R&D. Even Apple. I mean, at the time of the iPhone, I think Apple was spending just 2% of revenues on R&D. Nokia was spending 12%. So it's not just about how much money you spend. This is a good sort of dynamic capabilities point. It's about figuring out what the future is and positioning yourself right. So Apple did way better with little, but now Apple is, up. All of these companies around double-digit % of their revenue is spent on R&D. So there's massive commitment to the future, and so they are in a position to contribute to innovation. But to pick up on a Peter Thiel point that I tend to be sympathetic to, I mean, there are not all that many moonshots going on these days at the national level either. I mean, when John Kennedy said, "Hey, we're going to the moon," and the Apollo program, that this was a period of great optimism, willingness to take big, bold, gutsy bets. And dynamic capabilities, one way to summarize it is taking smart, big, bold, gutsy bets. You take a big, bold, gutsy bet that's wrong, and you can end your company's future. But being able to take considered and wise, big, bold, gutsy bets is what you need to leap ahead. And so we have this predicament that, while we have a modest amount of productivity growth in the American economy, it's all coming from the digital side. We got, 1 or 2% or something like that. But if you average it out, it's like 3 or 4% on the digital side and probably a negative number on the old world economies.
And the atoms.
Around the atoms. And so and that's sort of kind of worldwide. And you take Europe, of course, which doesn't participate, hasn't significantly participated in the digital revolution in the sense of having any significant platforms. I mean, it's in a deep problem because it's got all these demands for social programs to be supported and essentially no economic growth.
It seems to be a different cultural philosophy towards entrepreneurship over there as well.
I agree with you, and I've spent a reasonable amount of time in Europe, and I think this is, America's greatest attribute is our entrepreneurial mindset, which sort of, if you dig deep enough, I think it comes from the frontier mentality in the West, although the West is not the frontier anymore. Maybe the South is the new frontier. A willingness to be a little bit of a bandit, in quotes. It'll be a little bit outrageous, to be bold, and be a little bit of an outlaw not with a capital O, but with a small o. And you listen to American culture and music. It's all there, and it's not as deeply ingrained in the Europeans. And it seems to be deeply ingrained in China because of very much a trading and sort of entrepreneurial culture going back many, many years. But I still think that we have it more than most, and it's one of the great soft powers of America to sort of export this entrepreneurial culture.
It's sort of like celebrating the nonconformist in America, right?
Yeah.
But as I understand Chinese culture, that isn't so much that they celebrate the nonconformist, and yet they're both very entrepreneurial.
Well, in Japan, of course, a better case, there's much more conformity there. There's less conformity in China than I think there is in Japan. So Japan does great on incremental innovation because of that, but it's very hard for the Japanese to make big, bold bets. But China, of course, has the benefit of sniffing and into what's going on in the U.S., and as does Japan, as do other nations. The whole world actually gets a free seat at the table to observe what we're doing because we're an open society. And in some sense, we end up losing some of the benefit we might otherwise have because the people that don't have this entrepreneurial culture nevertheless see what we're doing and what we've done and can then jump in and scale it. And if you've got the resources, you can scale it and profit from it. And this is another paper I wrote many years ago, which is highly cited, called Profiting from Innovation. And the basic story is the pioneer doesn't always win, or doesn't usually win, in fact. It's those that can assemble the complementary assets, or, as you were saying before, that are willing to seize, to double down, spend big when it comes to rolling out the technology. The other ones that'll take the pot of gold. So we have to make sure we got the resources available. And this is where our capital markets come into play. And, the so-called shareholder activists, I think, aren't shareholder activists at all. Because a shareholder is someone who holds their shares, not just for a quarter, but for many years. But we've let these shareholder activists get in there, and they'll push companies to do stock buybacks, to do dividends, to give them returns now, not next year, not 10 years from now for sure, but now. And all of this is, deeply troubling to me. It's a very complicated regulatory and disclosure set of issues. that I think are undermining the ability of our public companies to make big, bold, gutsy bets. Because if you do, as a CEO, well, first of all, you probably won't get board support because they're all thinking about what might happen on the downside. So when I look around, to be honest, at the companies that got the strongest dynamic capability, there's typically a founder still very much involved with enough shares that they can, stare the board down and say, this is what we're doing. And the board is going to say, okay. Whereas, so-called strong boards will often stand in the way of anything that's, quote, to their mind, too risky. But coming back to Peter Thiel's point, we've pushed out, we've made lots of investments in things that are not risky, but they're not the ones that are going to drive productivity.
Yeah, look, you brought up a topic very dear to my heart, which is corporate governance. And certainly public company boards, there's an enormous amount of risk aversion. And part of the risk aversion, I think, comes from negative publicity. And I think this is how these activist shareholders are really able to influence and manipulate boards disproportionately by just the threat of negative publicity.
Well, yeah, it goes back, unfortunately, to the Enron debacle, which led to Sarbanes-Oxley, and then the most important person on the board was, the coordinator or the lead board member on accounting and so forth. So, ticking and tying the books and making sure that 25 cents didn't go amiss somewhere has been what boards have been focused on. It's the wrong thing. Strategic issues are lost because we've also populated with boards with people who have no clue about how to run a business and how to, to grasp a big opportunity. So, I'm all for diversity on boards, but it has to be cognitive diversity. It's not about race and gender, in my view. And we've made the huge mistake of thinking that it was. It's about diversity, but the most important form of diversity is cognitive diversity and getting people that are knowledgeable and networked and connected, and not just patsies. I'm fully in favor of pushing the CEO around, particularly when the CEO isn't being bold enough. You look at the Boeing disaster. I mean, these are boards are culpable there. Intel, I think, boards are culpable. They have not done the right jobs, in part because we've set up a regulatory apparatus that has deflected them from doing the right job.
Well, I think also there's been such little accountability for, you've mentioned Enron, but there really have been so many corporate scandals and failures over the years. And when were the directors ever held accountable for it?
Well,
it's very seldom, I think.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I want to. If you put the directors, make them liable for strategic errors, and they're not going to. They'll make the strategic error of doing nothing.
Right.
and that's the problem. I mean, is Kodak board responsible for the fact that Kodak developed many of the key technologies around digital film but failed to commercialize it? Yeah, I think in a way the board is culpable. I wouldn't hold them to financial liability for it, but they didn't, support a bold, aggressive approach to digital photography, and of course the iPhone then basically killed them. Well, screens killed them actually, as Ron Adden, one of my colleagues, points out. It was Kodak didn't think that people would view a photograph on a screen as a good substitute for print. So Kodak was all getting ready for the great burst of printing that was going to happen, high quality printing, and it didn't happen because people were quite happy to look at an image on a screen.
I remember, back in the 90s of the birth and rollout of the internet, I see a lot of similarities with what's going on with AI today and that. But, in the early days of the internet, no one really knew where it was going. And for us as, the small new-coming startups, we felt we could easily compete with large companies like IBM and Microsoft because they were kind of hamstrung by their board and by their bureaucracy and by this decisions have to be made in this certain manner, and we have to take all of these things into account. And the smaller startup, didn't have those constraints, so could just basically seize the opportunities immediately. Do you think those opportunities still exist today, where the small guys can compete with these giants?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the difference, of course, is as Apple's quite clear about this. We're not trying to be first. They say we're just trying to be best. So the big guys do have, if the ability to catch up. But at the same time, your first point is absolutely valid, which is that there's a lot of clunkiness around decision making in large organizations. First of all, you got to convince the CEO. He or she is probably not on the front line, and so someone has to convince the CEO, and then the CEO has to try and convince the board. Whereas in a startup, if the entrepreneur sees it and got sufficient funding, you can just go for it. So part of my dynamic competition framework is that whereas in the past we've always seen big companies as being powerful. If you've got a big market share, you're powerful. I say, no, you're generally vulnerable. That's the target. Nothing better for a small startup than to see a large company with a large market, because it's not intimidating. It's delightful because you know that they're going to be slow in reacting.
So coming back then to the lens of looking at entire nations like this, and what can New Zealand do in the world of AI when the US is like this giant one. It sounds like just because New Zealand is smaller doesn't mean that it can't participate in the race in some way. But should it be looking to have, the best AI innovation and we win on quality, or should we be looking for niches where the big guys aren't particularly playing, where maybe we have some natural advantages?
I think it's more the latter, to look for niches. I mean, I think with data centers, for instance, because New Zealand is, 80 or 90% hydroelectric power, you could be using that for data centers and have the greenest data centers in the world. The problem is that the submarine cables to New Zealand are pretty limited. So, being part of the global system is limited by that. But for training AI, you don't need to transmit globally. You just need to transmit locally. So I think New Zealand could be a great place for training AI. But also there's a whole bunch of social and political and geopolitical issues around standards and safeguards.
Ethics.
Where New Zealand is sort of a honest broker, a small player, can play a major role. And so my view is that New Zealand should sort of jump into that seat and kind of partner with the U.S. Because this is ultimately a battle between China and the Western world, and be part of the strategic setting of standards in a way that will benefit the West and protect our societies while giving us the most benefit from AI that we can possibly get.
I think one opportunity that New Zealand has, and this is perhaps a little bit controversial, but New Zealand actually has incredible richness and depth of data on all of its citizens at a government level. And they started the journey quite early on to link various government databases together at the back end, which is much more difficult to do in the United States due to privacy concerns. But Scott McNealy from Sun Microsystems famously said, and it was, I think, in the late 90s, forget about privacy, it's over. And the reality is that privacy is being challenged by these advanced IT systems. So New Zealand, I think, maybe has an opportunity to take the lead in spinning this thing on its head, and instead of going for we're free, open and transparent, go for we're the country where our citizens attract the most, and then show some benefit from that. Because if actually you can show some benefit from it, then maybe that makes the vision that many governments around the world seem to have of increasingly centralized data control over everyone, you could actually see some positive societal benefits from that.
Well, first of all, I don't agree completely with Scott McNealy. Health data, because of HIPAA in the United States, is very, very well protected. But outside of that, there's a lot of truth to what he said. But yes, I think the fact that national data sets and a lot of data coming back to training AI, I mean, that's probably a good place to train AI, or at least do one stage of training, and then maybe you train it somewhere else as well. But yeah, look, there are multiple niches, and I don't think New Zealand is really set up to address these opportunities at this point. And coming back to your earlier point about remote work, I mean, because Silicon Valley people can hop on an airplane and go to New Zealand and operate there quite effectively, and the visa circumstance is very open in that regard, at least for 6 months. There's 101 opportunities for New Zealand to participate in the AI revolution in the most positive way, but it has to get off its get out of the armchair a little bit and move on them.
See some of these opportunities and do some transforming.
Well, they're not even sensing them yet, I don't think.
Right.
The sensing drops into two phases: sensing and sense making. They may be doing the sensing part, but then there's the sense making, which is the other part of sensing. And a lot of people can see the same things happening, but some people make sense of it, others don't. And you have to make sense of it before you can act.
Right. And the digital nomads lifestyle that we were talking about before, that seems to me is one thing that New Zealand's very well positioned to tap into that. That if you want the reverse of a brain drain, if you want to attract large amounts of talent to your shores, play to your strengths, and New Zealand has some of the best natural environment in the world.
I agree, and it doesn't have to be attracting them permanently. Just if you attract them, for 6 months of the year, for 2 or 3 years in a row, and you've got hundreds of thousands of them, it will change the culture in New Zealand. It will lead to spin-offs. I mean, if so long as the nomads are not isolated from the rest of the Kiwi population. So the universities and other institutions can work hard, I think, to bring people together with the digital nomads and have a lasting impact. So yeah, there's some real assets New Zealand has, no question about it.
What's your view on intellectual property now and looking forward in the world? Do you think that this is something where being a creator of intellectual property is likely to be an increasingly lucrative career in the future, or do you think it's going to be decreasingly lucrative?
Well, look, we all depend on creators, and part of my story in the Profiting from Innovation framework is that creators have the most difficult job of anyone of getting value from what they do. In some sense, the business model for creativity really relies importantly on intellectual property. If you don't have intellectual property, then you've got to move into downstream activities to capture value. So the U.S., having the greatest density of creative types, needs to be strong on IP. And this is where I think big tech have been short-sighted. Big tech has sort of found IP to be a nuisance, and so they fight like hell rather than paying royalties to creators. And I think that's a strategic and tactical mistake for big tech. And I think the courts also have become relaxed, and the competition authorities, instead of being pro-IP, tend to be, well, they're schizophrenic, but they tend to be more anti-IP than pro-IP. I'm very pro-IP because otherwise the creators will get, they won't get properly rewarded, and we won't have as many of them. But at the same time, one has to be reasonable about this. And with AI like music, you can now formulate new tunes. Maybe from training your IP on the existing music libraries that are out there, and some of that may be recognizable, some of it not. There needs to be mechanisms developed to reward the creators, and to have AI sort of merely just learn from ingesting the library and not having some mechanism of compensation, I don't think is ethically right, and at the same time, it won't, it will denude the creative community of the returns it needs to continue being creative. So there's a bunch of new IP issues coming along. I mean, we went through this with Napster to begin with, And Steve Jobs found a solution with digital rights management, $1 a song, and it was less than what the creators had been getting before, but it was something that over time has grown to be, a reasonable substitute. And I think with AI, we need to find something like that. So digital rights management is going to be an important future.
I think one consequence of being the number one most cited academic in Google Scholar is that the AI is trained on your material, and probably every paper that you've ever written has already been fed into these AI models. And if you go and talk to them about David Teece's work, they do a pretty good representation of it. How do you feel about that as a creator of intellectual property?
Yeah, well, unlike a musician, that maybe their only source of income is from their music, in my case, I'm diversified. My business model, I suppose, is diversified because I'm an active consultant. I've built companies. I'm an investor. So,
So you've taken that leap from just being a creator, like many academics, to also being an entrepreneur.
Yes, I have. Beginning first with being, having an entrepreneurial mindset and doing a lot of things on campus that were entrepreneurial, and creating new centers and institutes and things like that. But I tend to be in the camp of I would sooner have it available than locked up. But if it is available, if there's some royalty structure, some modest royalty structure, I think, for authors, so that when it does scale big, you can get the returns from it. That would be beneficial to the system. I mean, you have to take a systems view and say, what's right here is what will bring the healthiest ecosystem, if you will, for both use and creation of new knowledge.
And so you think that finding a new licensing model for royalties within the world of AI that's a step in the right direction towards that?
Yeah, and I think publishers are going to be scratching their head thinking about this. Everybody's thinking about it, and this is where there is a role for the courts and for governments to sit down and figure these things out. I mean, I mentioned earlier that there's around AI that there's ethical standards, there's other protections, there's a whole plethora of things that need attention by communities, not just by individuals. And government can have a role there. I don't want to leave everything to government at all. In fact, very often it's trade associations and other groups that are the ones that should be involved here. But there is a need for collective action and collective decision making. And in a world where people seem to be, a lot more distant and separate, perhaps this is even more salient and probably harder to achieve than it might have been in the past, but no less necessary.
For a professor or academic out there who's maybe not quite at your level of 200,000 plus citations, maybe starting out a bit more in their career, would you advise them to become entrepreneurs, or what's the best thing they can do to get their work out there?
Well, to get their work out there, being an entrepreneur doesn't get your work out there. What gets your work out there is to contribute to the body of knowledge, and in a foundational way. I mean, I think a lot of academics are making very small incremental steps, doing very small things, taking some existing framework and I've got some new piece of evidence. And while all of that's valuable, very few people are doing what I've sort of tried to do, which is to think about whether the fundamental frameworks and structures that we use, at least in the social sciences, are fit for purpose anymore. And I like to say that finding a good problem is harder than solving a problem. And there's a lot of decisions that are made based on false assumptions that people don't even know that's a false assumption. And you have to dig deep into the structure of knowledge and the world stock of knowledge in your field to know why people assume basic things, and understanding the history of intellectual thought is very important. So and when I look around today, I find almost none of the young scholars have any clue where a lot of the basic ideas in the textbook came from. If you don't have any clue where they came from, you're not really in a position to re-engineer the knowledge base. And so, I feel that my global leadership has almost been thrust upon me by the fact that everybody else has been deflected into narrow avenues of inquiry that may be, technically interesting, but from a foundational point of view, are wrong or irrelevant.
So tackle the big problems.
Tackle the big problems, and you have to be willing to take a long view. Like in this area of dynamic competition, I've been writing for 30 years, and my initial audience on this was about 3 people, and then it was 30 people. And it stayed not more than 30 to 40 people for maybe 2.5 decades. But now dynamic competition is the new paradigm that people are taking very seriously, and thousands of people are digging in and trying to understand it, and hopefully help contribute to fleshing this thing out. Because one person can't create a new paradigm; it takes a community, and so I'm delighted to see other people jumping in. But the point is, you have to have staying power, and you have to have commitment, and you have to be willing to sit without accolades for a long period of time.
And what about building your personal brand and kind of creating your own accolades?
Well, I shouldn't, and no one should follow my example in that regard, because I've been really quite terrible and non-focused on building my personal brand. I'm now thinking about it for the first time, actually, and realizing with social media that there's a lot of opportunity to do so. If I could have a digital assistant, that is, because I'm time constrained. I'm working across multiple areas of scholarship. I'm investing in many areas, and I've also got 4 or 5 startups that I'm working on as well. So my constraint is time, and with a digital assistant of some kind, I think I could do a lot better at building my personal brand. And I would feel good about that. Whether it makes money or not is very much a secondary thing. But when you spend so much of your life working out new frameworks and paradigms, you get a lot of satisfaction if they take off and people start to use them, because it's sort of, okay, my efforts were really worthwhile, and they're making a difference, so I can get satisfaction from that. And there's many, many ways in which you can get gratification, and getting dollars for it is just one of many.
Great. Well, I think that's an excellent note to end today's conversation. So, David Teece, thank you very much for your time. And everybody, thanks for watching the Level 5 podcast.
My pleasure.